Hello. Hey. Cannot type today. So I didn't like the sound and the delay that was coming up on my desktop. I don't know what the deal was. Oh man, he's gonna double chin. Anyway, so I have my Chromebook in front of me. I've got my computer over here, and I got all the questions that you all have submitted for me, and hopefully you guys can ask some questions in the group chat. Um, and we'll get this thing going. So, someone had asked me about like all specific dates, which how you remember the order of events, and I'm terrible with dates. I make this joke every year. I can never remember my anniversary. Um, but you should know some big things like 1776 is when we declared our independence, and we celebrate our independence from the moment we signed the Declaration of Independence, not from when we actually win the war. And then you should just have some like journal ideas of like when things are taking place. So like in my class, we did that timeline review. The U.S. Regents goes chronologically, so you have an idea of when things are happening. You're good to go. Um, so um, so early American history proclamation of 1763. That is where the British basically say you can't pass the Appalachian Mountains. You have to say and you, me, and the colonists have to say east of the Appalachian Mountains so that they can prevent future conflicts with Native Americans. Also, it's easier to find and tax people when they're stuck in one area and they can't flee into the wilderness. Then 1776, Declaration of Independence, and it keeps going from there. Um, you have in the mid 1800s, you have industrialization, you have the Gilded Age, the rise of American business, and then towards the end of the 1800s is where we move into like the Progressive Era. The Decade of Crisis, 1850 to 1860, is where you have lots and lots of conflict leading up to the Civil War, so on and so forth. In the 1800s, and the 1800s into the early 1900s, you also have U.S. imperialism taking place, World War One, like 1917 to the U.S., and then you have the 1920s is the Roaring Twenties, of course, and then 1929 stock market crashes. Then that ushers us into the Great Depression during the 1930s. 1941 U.S. is going to start getting involved with World War II. December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. That's when Pearl Harbor is attacked. It's actually probably one of the few days I actually remember, not my anniversary, but there's that. From World War II, it ends, and then we enter into the Cold War, which continues from 1945 at the end of World War II into 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses. Um, During that time, there's a lot going on. I mean, that's just a general rundown, uh, U.S. history in like a minute. But I would, you can look at general U.S. history timelines. If you're in my class, we have timelines in Google Classroom you can see as well to kind of help you with that. So some other questions. I'm going to try to stick with try to go chronological based off of what you guys have asked me. So, early American history, um, people are asking about the Constitution and the loose versus strict interpretation of the Constitution. So, this is like one of those early, I get glares a lot. I'm sorry. Loose versus strict interpretation of the Constitution is basically like, do we look at the actual words of the Constitution? And if it doesn't say we can do or can't do something, then that's it. It's a very strict interpretation. It has to be written in the Constitution, or else you can't do it. Whereas a loose interpretation, there's more flexibility. It's open to interpretation. If it doesn't explicitly tell the government they can't do something, then they could probably get away with it. And this really comes down to a lot of conflict with Hamilton and Jefferson, especially with like the National Bank and things like that. Like Hamilton was like, well, the Constitution doesn't say I can't make a national bank, so it's necessary and proper that we establish a national bank in order to manage the funds of the United States. And so Hamilton, big proponent of loose interpretation of the Constitution, really thought that the Constitution was flexible, especially because of the elastic clause allowing Congress to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out their functions. Whereas Thomas Jefferson was very much a strict constitutionalist. He believed if it wasn't written down in the Constitution, you could not do it. And this created a lot of conflict for Hamilton and Jefferson. And then, of course, Jefferson got a lot of backlash for being a hypocrite because when he does become president, he is presented with an opportunity to purchase Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for a pretty good deal. It was about $15 million. Originally, he was just trying to get the port of New Orleans, but when presented with the entire territory, Louisiana, he felt like it was a really good deal. So he used his powers as president to negotiate a treaty that included the purchase of Louisiana. There's something in the Constitution that would actually create a guideline for the president to purchase territory. So he argued this as a loose interpretation. He just felt like it was such a good deal for the nation. He had to put his personal beliefs aside. But he was highly criticized for that. And a lot of people were a little nervous about this purchase. Of course, once Lewis and Clark started to explore Louisiana Territory, realized how beneficial it was for the United States. Um, Another question people ask is like the significance of the War of 1812. Um, so leading up to the War of 1812, there's still a lot of conflict between the United States and Great Britain that just wasn't really quite being resolved. After the American Revolution, Britain was supposed to have left the United States, and they still hadn't fully left some of the areas. And then they were impressing U.S. sailors, like forcing them to work on British ships, and this created a lot of problems. And then ultimately, the War of 1812 took place. Um, there wasn't any major exchange of territory at the end with the Treaty of Ghent, but Andrew Jackson does have a big victory in New Orleans. Unfortunately for them, there was no Twitter and they didn't realize, but the war actually finished a couple days prior to this big battle. But it kind of helped Andrew Jackson make a name for himself. But the big thing that was that it showed the world that the United States could maintain its own again and was able to defend itself against Great Britain once more. And then this kind of like helped unify the nation because they had a common enemy, and this ushers in this era of good feelings. There was just a lot of like positivity and development, which of course kind of starts to come to an end as we expand westward and we see an increase in conflict over the spread of slavery and then ultimately the Decade of Crisis and the Civil War. um, Speaking of conflict and the Civil War, there's quite a few questions about this. So, as we expand westward, there's a lot of compromise over the issue of slavery. And part of this has to do with trying to maintain um, a balance of power in Congress. If there are 11 free states and 11 slave states, they have equal representation in the Senate, a little bit more equal of power. But if that balance was a tip one way or the other, it could impact the region. So they were really trying to maintain it. Um, and what we see, just I see some of the questions you guys post. I'll get to those. Is they make compromises. So the Missouri Compromise in 1820 was an attempt to keep this balance of power. So they basically argued that Missouri will enter as a slave state, and Maine will enter as a um, free state, and that kind of basically balances it out. And let me get my glasses because I took some notes. So I didn't forget anything important for you guys. And they basically made slavery illegal above the 3630 line, excluding Missouri, because they want to keep that balance. So it was like 11 and 11 free versus slave states. Um, And what we see is ultimately the Supreme Court in Dred Scott versus Sanford will rule that the Missouri Compromise is illegal. They say it's unconstitutional. Congress really can't pass laws banning slavery in territories or all these areas. And we then see in the Compromise of 1850, California becomes a free state. But the District of Columbia, DC, will have a ban on slavery. And let's see, there's a bunch of other ones. Basically, what we see though is these all have to do with slavery. They'll never ask you the difference between the two. If you even remember that both of these compromises, these documents, are an attempt to compromise in Congress over the spread of slavery and maintain that balance of power in Congress between slave and free states, you'll be pretty good. And keep in mind, these compromises ultimately just kind of starve off or stave off um, what will actually become like the Civil War. There's just, they kept putting off this conflict by making these compromises, but these compromises was just kind of like a band aid and weren't really working. And then ultimately they'll fail and there'll be a war on those. So along these compromises, there's also like the Kansas Nebraska Act, which allows each of those states to vote on the issue of slavery. So in Kansas and Nebraska Act, there's what's called popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, sovereignty is rule. So popular rule, that means that people could vote. So what you have is people in the north and people in the south moving west into Kansas and Nebraska so that they can influence the balance of power between free and slave states. So this isn't just an issue of keeping people like enslaved, as abolitionists would see it in the North, but in the South, that is the very basis of their economic system. And for many of the plantation owners, they see this as a threat to the economic survival of the South. So you have people in the North move west, people in the South move west into Kansas and Nebraska to vote on this issue. And this leads to things like the bleeding of Kansas, where there's violence between abolitionists and pro slavery advocates, and people end up dying. And one of the very like kind of radical, outspoken abolitionists, people who want to abolish slavery, is John Brown. So John Brown was a white guy. You probably saw him with like showing him with like a beard and looks all crazy, but that was like he actually grew that out as like a disguise, because him and his followers raided an arsenal, like a stash of weapons at Harper's Ferry, and he really believed that the only way that they would end slavery is by arming slaves and leading this massive revolt. Of course, he's caught along with a number of his followers, and they're executed. And in the North, he becomes like this martyr for the cause. But in the South, they're like, look at these crazy abolitionists. They're trying to kill people and arm our slaves. So that's John Brown. And those are some of the issues during the decade of crisis, where there's just a lot of conflict over balancing this power between free and slave. But also in the decade of crisis leading up to the Civil War, there's also like tariffs, which are taxes on imports, being passed, which makes it hard for the South because they are a cash crop society. So they have to import a lot of other goods, and this means they have to pay more money for it, and that hurts them economically. So there's always this conflict going on in this decade, not only between slavery but tariffs, and like should the federal government have certain rights over the states. And then ultimately Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. He was an abolitionist, but didn't necessarily want to end slavery as president. He just didn't believe in it spreading at the time. And of course, when he becomes president in 1860, a number of southern states secede, starting with South Carolina, and then this ultimately will lead to the Civil War. Um, and during the Civil War, he will give the Gettysburg Address. This Gettysburg Address commemorates the losses of both sides at the Battle of Gettysburg. It's one of the single like bloodiest battles in United States history. And he points out that both sides have lost, and we are fighting for like a new freedom. Um, trying to see. I don't want to forget anything else that you guys are posting. And of course, someone asked about the um, Emancipation Proclamation. So, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't actually free any slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln signs only frees slaves in states in the South in active rebellion. So, if these states had basically been like the neutral border states that didn't leave the Union, it didn't count, and they could have their slaves. So obviously, if you are in active rebellion against the United States, and the Confederacy had the Confederate States of America, they had Jefferson Davis as their president. They're not did was it helped as a military strategy. Abolitionists in the North now kind of have this renewed sense of hope, like this, we are going to end slavery. So many of them would join the cause. Free black men would join the cause. Any slaves that did escape would probably join the cause. But also, the South was in negotiation with a number of European nations, such as Great Britain, who had already outlawed slavery. And they're like, sorry, guys, we can't support you anymore because then we'd be hypocrites. So it was more of like an economic strategy in that sense. Slavery doesn't officially end until the Civil War comes to an end and the 13th Amendment is passed, which ends slavery. And then the 14th Amendment will make former slaves citizens, and then the 15th Amendment gives them the right to vote, because you have to be free, then citizens, before you can vote. So I can kind of help you remember the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Um, so um, Abraham Lincoln, unfortunately, as we entered into the post Civil War era called Reconstruction, is assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer. And Andrew Johnson, his VP, takes over. Johnson is a Southerner and he's a Democrat. And much like Lincoln, Andrew Johnson believed that the South should be readmitted quickly. That he wanted to go easy on them, so that they could bind up the nation's wounds and move on, as Lincoln had said. But the radical Republicans in Congress, these are staunch abolitionists. They were like, those Southern states left. They broke their vow. They need to reapply to be a state. They need to take an oath of allegiance. We're going to put them under military districts to control them until they comply with everything, and they're going to pay. And of course, this leads to a lot of tension between Johnson and the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans attempt to impeach him for breaking a law, where he couldn't like remove someone from office without Congress's approval. They missed by one vote. So while he was impeached, that doesn't mean he was actually removed from office. Someone asked the difference between Andrew Johnson and Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson was president during the issues with the Indian removal and like Worcester versus Georgia Supreme Court case, where we see Native Americans, especially like the Cherokee in Georgia and stuff, are going to be pushed west of the Mississippi, ultimately on reservations, to allow white settlers to move into their land. So Andrew Jackson also did not like the National Bank and basically broke it up. He supported Indian removal, even though the Supreme Court ruled that these federal treaties couldn't be voided without like a new treaty. They were like, you can't just make a law and like violate federal treaties. But Jackson refused to support the Supreme Court decisions because he was okay with Indian removal. Jackson is also known for the spoils system. Leading up to Jackson's election, we see a lot of poor white men who didn't own property and couldn't vote prior be able to vote. And so Jackson's elected by many of these people because he's like a man of the people. Old Hickory, he really kind of was like a self-made man, a war hero from the War of 1812. And he believed in the spoils system. So people who supported his election and supported him, he would often spoils, so to speak, by awarding them with government jobs. And this, sometimes lent to incompetent people having positions of authority and power. But he argued this allowed people who would be excluded prior from now being able to participate more in the government. The spoil system comes to an end, though, when Garfield, a president, is like assassinated by a supporter who he refused to give a job to. And then they're like, this is a bad idea. So that's why now, if you want a government job, you need to prove you can do it by taking civil service exams. So, like post office, police officers, firemen, even like court secretaries. If you want a government position, there's a test you have to take to prove that you know how to like do the job. Um, they're no idea what the thematic essay could be on. You just don't know. Some of the popular topics for thematic essays: presidential actions and decisions, Supreme Court cases, amendments, foreign and domestic policy, reform movements. If you've been in my class, I've talked about double dipping. Like there's topics that you could use for multiple um, thematics. So, for example, you could talk about civil rights for Japanese Americans, and you could talk about FDR's decision and his domestic policy to relocate Japanese citizens into internment camps during World War II. You could talk about civil rights for women and reform movements for women, and also talk about the 19th Amendment. And you're covering multiple essays for that. For the Civil War, the big things that they focus on are kind of things I just covered. They focus on the causes, and they're looking at the impacts. That's like Reconstruction, like the South is destroyed economically, physically. Like you have bridges and roads and everything else that are torn up. Their whole society is going to change because there's no longer slave labor. So that's where they turn to sharecropping and tenement farming. One of the questions on the old region states that the Monroe Doctrine followed the principles of George Washington's farewell address. So George Washington's farewell address focused on isolation and neutrality. He, in the farewell address, not only said that you should um, watch out for political parties because they're dangerous, but he also was like, we shouldn't have permanent alliances with other nations. He really believed we should be neutral and kind of isolate to really focus on our own development without the influence of other outside nations. So the Monroe Doctrine was another way to try to isolate the United States and the Western Hemisphere. So when it was first written, it basically was like a statement to Europe: hey, don't try to come into the Western Hemisphere and reconquer all these like Latin American nations that just got independence from Spain. Don't try to re-exert control. And part of that is that the U.S. was seeing this as an opportunity to keep Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere, but also allow these new nations to develop as well as the United States. Of course, when Theodore Roosevelt expands on that with the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, we see the U.S. is going to become more active and more involved in Latin America. Excuse me. Um, okay. So before I move on, it's timeline of Reconstruction. Basically, what you need to know is Civil War ends, we enter Reconstruction. There is a conflict between Lincoln and Johnson versus the Radical Republicans on how we're going to handle Reconstruction. Lincoln and Johnson were like, the states never actually left the U.S. They don't have that power. And therefore, we need to help them rebuild and move on. And the Radical Republicans were like, no. When they left, they seceded, they broke away. They need to reapply for statehood and they need to be punished. Of course, with Lincoln being assassinated and Johnson not being popular by Congress, Radical Republicans really take control. So right after the Civil War ends, the South passes black codes, which severely limits the movements of blacks in the South. um, The radical Republicans are able then to pass what are known as the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. These 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments will end slavery, give them citizenship, and then allow black males the right to vote in the South. During this time, the South will also be placed under Military Reconstruction Act under military districts, where the U.S. military will oversee these areas while they can create new state constitutions that makes slavery illegal. They start to help rebuild the South. They establish new economic systems such as tenant farming, sharecropping. Tenant farming, you pay a fee to farm. Sharecropping, you give a share of the crop in exchange for working on the land. We also see that the Southern Democrats ultimately will gain more and more power. They're getting angry that like Republicans from the North are moving into the South and really influencing them. And then finally, with the Compromise of 1877, Hayes becomes president, military reconstruction ends, and then we see that Southern Democrats kind of regain control in the South. They tend to be white males who were plantation owners, also farmers. And after they take hold, that's where we see a shift into Jim Crow laws, where they start to create segregation and laws to limit the movements of blacks even more than the black codes had. And that's the extent of Reconstruction. Okay, let me see if I missed anything else. I'm kind of switching back and forth between your chat and what my students had submitted prior. I will go over some key Supreme Court cases towards the end, so don't panic about that. But I have some people asking about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So the Gilded Age kind of comes from this saying where something's gilded, it's like a thin layer of gold on the outside, and everything looks really really pretty. So this is the rise of American business, industrialization, and America is booming business wise. And from the outside looking in, everything looks wonderful. The economy is growing and expanding. There's a lot of trade. People are making a lot of money in America, but that's not the whole story. I always think about if you've ever seen an American Tail with Fievel, the little mouse, and they're on the boat coming over from Europe, and they're like, the streets are paved with cheese and there's no cats. So there's this like idea in America the streets were paved with gold, which is just ridiculous because A, gold's soft, B, it's worth a lot of money, so people just steal it. But in this cartoon, all these little mice immigrating to the US were like, oh, the streets are made of cheese and there's no cats, like life is great. When in reality, the vast majority of Americans are really struggling. There's a lot of poverty. There's a huge gap between the rich and poor. And you have a lot of businesses recruiting immigrants to come to America to work for very low wages, which drives down wages for people born in America. And of course, this is like an era where we start to see like a rise in nativism, this idea where native born Americans, so not indigenous persons, but people of like European descent who were born in America are better than the current immigrants. And ironically, many of these nativists are like first and second generation Americans. And I always say, if you've seen the gangs in New York, the butcher is a perfect example of a nativist. Like he's like a child of an immigrant, but looked down on all immigrants. Um, and so there's a lot of problems. People are very poor. They're living in tenements. They're extremely close. There's no sanitation. Disease spreads throughout here. If you're injured or get sick, you lose your job and you can't afford to go to the doctors. And like their children die very young. There's a lot of political corruption because we don't have like a lot of the laws we have now. And then so what we see is towards the end of the 1800s, a social movement, reform movement, like for progressives, and they want to progress society. And so the progressive movement is in response to this Gilded Age. Like, we need to fix the problems economically, socially, politically. So you see political changes like at the state and federal level, referendum, recalls, direct primaries, initiatives. These all address political corruption. You have these political machines like Boss Tweed, where you get a group of politicians that really control an area, and it leads to corruption. So with a recall, you now have a power as a voter to recall someone from office. So this happened, I think, in Wisconsin a few years ago. Scott Walker, very um, controversial. They had a recall vote to try to remove him from office, and they didn't have enough votes, so he stayed in office. But the people had an opportunity to try to remove. A referendum is how people can vote on laws. So when you go to vote at an election, on the back of the ballot, there'll sometimes be referendums to vote on. So states like Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, and these places that have legalized recreational use of marijuana have done these through referendums, having people to vote on them. Initiative allows you to initiate a law. So you can call up your like representatives and say, I have an idea for a law. And so, for example, you say, I think we should have school zones. We do now, but at one point we didn't. That people have to drive slower. So then they initiate that law, and that eventually will come through as a referendum. And then a direct primary means that you get to vote in a primary to directly elect your representative. So when there's a Republican or Democratic primary, Democrats go and elect who they want to be the representative of their party. And then the Republicans do the same. Prior to that, the political party themselves would choose who's going to represent them. And then, of course, this led to a lot of controversy. As far as like some economic reforms, you have people like Theodore Roosevelt support like the Sherman Antitrust Act, like Clayton Antitrust Act to try to break up monopolies that are ending competition. Um, but then you also have like the Meat Inspection Act, right? Like, so all these muckrakers are writing about all these terrible things happening, and Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle, and they find out about all this terrible like corruption going on in the meatpacking industry and people being sold terrible food. So then Theodore Roosevelt supports the or the Meat Inspection Act and the Food and Drug Act. So now when we buy food, there's a list of what's in there. The USDA will to inspect meat to make sure it's safe for consumption. Like all of this deals with economic problems. And then there's social problems that have to be dealt with. Unions form and they fight for like the 8-hour day, the 5-day work week, um, health insurance, unemployment insurance, eventually. Also, like insurance for if you get sick, like health insurance, short term disability, even limits on child labor. Most of you in the 1800s would not have been in school. You would have been working probably in a factory or a field someplace, depending on what part of the country you lived in. It was just part of the course. So that all changes during the progressive era. Okay. As far as the change from the gold standard, there's been a number of times in our history where people have talked about the gold standard. So the gold standard, we used to have actual bars of gold in Fort Knox that backed our currency. And there was a number of times where, there. I'm thinking like with William McKinley and the populist and rage movement to support farmers. A lot of them supported not just having a gold standard, but also using silver. Because they're like, then we'll have more money. We'll have gold and silver to represent our money. And they call that like the bimetallic standard. But the problem with that is that can just lead to inflation. If you just throw a bunch of money in the pot, it can lead to inflation. The Germans and Weimar Republic after World War One found out the hard way. We just print more money, it leads to inflation, and then your money's worthless. So like, there's a really delicate balance in the economy, and ultimately, FDR during the Great Depression will have us kind of switch from like the gold standard where we actually have bars of gold representing our money to fiat money. So like our value of the money is basically backed by the government, and it's I'm not an economics teacher. I actually hated economics in college. Don't tell my boss that. But it's like a whole system, and it's our money has value based off the fact that our government backs it, and it's based off of our economy and how well the economy is going. That's why exchange rates change. But we don't have bars of gold sitting in Fort Knox anymore representing the U.S. dollar, and that's the shift from the gold standard. The Populist Party was big during like the Gilded Age. They really pushed for like populist platform. which would support like government control over railroad lines and kind of standardization of that, because a lot of railroad companies were exploiting small farmers but giving kickbacks to big businesses. They also supported the bimetallic standard. William McKinley was one of the last big populist like presidential candidates, and he did not win. But they really kind of supported the little guy, like farmers, factory workers, things like that. Some people talk about President Trump being a populist leader because he appeals to um, workers, like blue collar workers and people in like the Rust Belt and things like that. So as far as during the Great Depression, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was an attempt to pull us out of the Great Depression. They are trying to institute reform of our capitalistic society, recovery to help people in trouble, and I'm sorry, in businesses, and like relief for like the people who have lost their jobs. New Deal is like the alphabet soup because there are a bunch of like acronyms. You're not going to remember all of them. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was developed to basically regulate the um, stock market, still exists. You had like the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. You also had like the NRA, the National Recovery Act, not National Rifle Association. There's also like the Works Progress Association, the Tennessee um, Works Act. Like all these acronyms, basically, if you're taking the test and you've hit a question about like World War I, and then you see something about like the Dust Bowl or Great Depression, and then you see a bunch of acronyms, you're probably hitting the New Deal. And basically, these were a lot of attempts to try to kind of regulate big business and help poor people. He also creates like Social Security during this time period. But the Supreme Court ruled a lot of these were unconstitutional. The government was overstepping their boundaries when it came to like regulating business. Congress can regulate inter between states trade, but not um, intra within a state, and so that became a conflict. And like the Supreme Court oversaw this. So this is where like the court packing scheme came in, where FDR was like, "Hey, we should add more Supreme Court justices. It's a great idea, and I get to nominate them, so they're all gonna like me and they'll agree with me." And people were like, "Yeah, no, that's not a good idea, FDR. You're not getting more Supreme Court justices." They're not going to ask you specifically what a New Deal Act does. You might get like a picture of a guy holding a sign like looking for work, and it's like, which New Deal Act like helped this, and it's the one that says like work in the title, like Works Progress Association or whatever. But they're not going to ask you like the difference between them. They're not going to if they ask you what they are, it's going to be really obvious. um Let me see. I'm trying to stay in chronological order, so I'm kind of skipping around. Someone asked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Just like it sounds, it's an act to exclude Chinese people from America. So we see that there's a lot of immigration coming over, like while we're building the transcontinental railroad, and part of that is we have businesses going to China, asking these people to move to the United States for work, and a lot of them were hired on the West Coast to work on the railroad, and so a lot of other workers saw them as driving wages down. They're being recruited. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is basically a law that blocked Chinese people from immigrating to the United States. Another act that's similar is the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, basically prevented more Japanese men from coming over and immigrating to America. Um, the Gentleman's Agreement piece was that if a Japanese male was already here, they could send for like their wives and like children to come over, but more males couldn't come. Okay. So, Spanish American War. So this is like as the U.S. was expanding their power, um, and we're industrializing, and we're becoming more powerful. And we see in Europe there's a lot of imperialism. And so Spain at that point was still like in Cuba and Puerto Rico and other parts of the world. And Spain wasn't necessarily treating the citizens of like Cuba and Puerto Rico or Guam or the Philippines nice. And the United States by this point has millions of dollars invested in Cuba. And so you have some calls to go to war with Spain, not only to protect the US interests, but to help the Cuban people. And so you have like yellow journalism, that sensational reporting, and they're really kind of building up the atrocities being carried out by Spain to try to garner support or gain support for the Spanish American War. And then the USS Maine is docked in Havana, Cuba, and it explodes and sinks. And that's when all the newspapers start to print these exaggerated articles like remember the Maine, the USS Maine, and we see a lot of war cries. And so the Spanish American War takes place and we defeat Spain rather quickly, the United States, and with defeat of Spain, the US gets their first overseas territories: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Um, Cuba quickly pushed back and was like, no, you said we could be free. We want to be free. So ultimately, the US gives Cuba the freedom. And then the US still controls Puerto Rico and we still control Guam. And for a while, the U.S. tried to hold on to the Philippines, but there was a war where they pushed back. And then ultimately, the U.S. did give them their freedom. There's still a very large U.S. presence there. But the significance of the Spanish American War is typically in the idea that the U.S. is becoming a world power now. We have colonies. We've become imperialistic beyond our borders. Um, just skimming through to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Um, are there any other questions before I get into like the Cold War? Because some people are asking me questions about the Cold War, and I didn't know if there's anything prior to that. Um, Theodore Roosevelt is one of the first like big progressive presidents. So this is during the progressive era where a lot of people are starting to question the Gilded Age and the rise of American business, where all these like robber barons are exploiting their workers and taking advantage of situations to get rid of competition. And so Theodore Roosevelt's domestic policy was like a square deal, like a fair deal for everyone. He really wanted to get rid of these bad trusts. Um, he wanted to start to move towards protecting American workers, but also like conserving land. Like he created the national parks, which is great. I'm gonna hit up some of them this summer. But the square deal, yeah, he just wanted a fair deal for people in response to a lot of the problems. Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna see if there's any more questions before I get into the Cold War, because the Cold War is gonna take me really up to the modern era. I'm just pulling up some notes for you guys. Okay. So the Cold War starts after World War II. And we have two superpowers emerge after World War II: the United States and the Soviet Union. And a lot of this is conflict over ideology. You know, the Soviet Union is communist and atheist. The US has a strong Christian presence and are capitalistic and support democracy. So the United States, with her allies, forms NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So I think it's the North Atlantic. So it's like U.S., Canada, Western Europe. And in response to that, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, which is like Russia and all of her satellite states and allies. And so we have these two like alliances. It's relying on collective security. We're going to work together as a collective to protect each other. And this basically, takes us through the Cold War, these alliances. And throughout this Cold War, the US is trying to contain communism with various degrees of success. So you have like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan early on, giving like military aid and money to nations trying to withhold or keep communist influence out of their nations. We also see the domino theory, where the U.S. is convinced if communism spreads into like Southeast Asia, the rest of them will fall, which is why we get involved in Vietnam. And these are called like proxy wars. So someone asked what a proxy war is. So a proxy war is like we weren't actually fighting the Soviet Union, but we had these like hotspots, these areas of conflict where we were fighting these proxy wars. So Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, even like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or like these proxy wars where there was like conflict involving the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but we're never directly fighting the Soviet Union. Um, so the Cuban Missile Crisis is, Cuba has had the revolution. Fidel Castro takes over. He's communist. And since he's communist, the U.S. doesn't want anything to do with him. They hate him. And so naturally, he bonds with other communists. And so he turns to the Soviet Union for support. And the Soviets are like, sure, can we put some missiles on your island? Because you're like really close to the U.S., 90 miles. And then, then we can target any place in the United States, and the Soviets saw that this was the right thing to do because the United States had to put missiles in Turkey, which would allow them to hit strategic points in the Soviet Union. Of course, the U.S. has some spy planes fly over Cuba. They take images and see these missiles, and then this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where for 13 days the Soviet Union and the U.S. go back and forth. So like Khrushchev and JFK are going back and forth. You take your missiles out. No, you take your missiles out. You better not invade Cuba. You better get your missiles out of Cuba. And this is going back and forth. Meanwhile, the whole world is holding their breath, waiting for a possible nuclear war. Ultimately, the Soviet Union says, remove your missiles from Turkey and promise not to invade Cuba, and we will take our missiles out of Cuba. And the U.S. is like, we won't invade Cuba, take your missiles out, but we are not going to take our missiles out of Turkey. Ultimately, the missiles are removed both from Turkey and from Cuba. The U.S. lifts the blockade of Cuba that prevented ships from kind of in and out, but they did create an embargo and refuse to trade with Cuba. The Obama administration started to lift some of this, which is why you could do like cruises and stuff to Cuba. But the current Trump administration has started to roll that back and kind of re-exert some of those embargoes and sanctions, refusing the trade and preventing travel into Cuba again. So after World War II, despite the fact that there's a Cold War going on, a lot of people are pretty excited to like be alive, I guess. And there's also this return to like kind of a conservative ideology, like family home life. Think about like TV shows like, Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy, and like all these like shows where people really just focus on like the family life. So there's a big push when people come back from World War II to settle down and have their little house with the white picket fence and like 2.3 kids and a little dog and a station wagon. And so there's this big baby boom and all these kids are born, and there's a big increase, and like schools are like inundated with children. They need bigger schools and more classrooms and more teachers. But the problem is all of those kids born in the baby boom are now getting older. And this is referred to as the grain of America, because all these baby boomers are now retiring and they're getting older. And there are going to be more older people retired collecting Social Security than younger people working paying into it. And so there's this fear that there won't be enough people working and paying into Social Security to keep it working and alive. So kind of back to Cold War focus. So you have these proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam, and Korea is kind of like the first big conflict with like this issue of communism. And they had been divided already, but we had seen that communism pushed further south into Korea and then pushed back. And the big takeaway is at the end of the Korean War or the Korean Civil War, depending on how you look at it, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, still exists. There's still a communist North Korea and still a democratic, capitalistic South Korea. And yay for K-pop. Um, Not the case in Vietnam. Vietnam, you still had a strong communist presence in the north, just like in North Korea, because they shared a border, with communist China. So you'd have that influence coming down. But ultimately, after so many years of fighting to try to prevent the spread of communism, um, the Vietnam War, which is very unpopular, a lot of people were dying from the U.S., and the U.S. pulls out and abandons Saigon, and it falls to communism. And Vietnam, unlike Korea, is reunited as a communist nation. While they have moved towards a little bit more capitalism to compete in the global market today, they still have a lot of communist policies that are a holdover from Ho Chi Minh and all of that. Go back to my submitted questions to see if I missed anything. So someone was asking about the difference between the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. So think of an Iron Curtain kind of like, my window curtain. It it's like a thin veil. The Iron Curtain's not an actual curtain made of iron. That would be ridiculous. But basically, Winston Churchill, the prime minister in Great Britain, was like during this early days of the Cold War, was like it's like an iron curtain had descended along Europe. It's a very harsh divide between Western democratic capitalistic Europe and Eastern communist Europe. And so this iron curtain will sometimes be shown in political cartoons as like a wall of iron, and you'll see like the hammer and sickle for communists on there, but it wasn't an actual physical thing. It's a political division. The Berlin Wall was an actual wall. So in 1961, in Berlin, the city of Berlin, so Germany at this point was divided in half. So when Merritt was little, that's me, I was a child, there was two Germanys. There's East Germany, which is influenced and controlled by the Soviets. And then there was West Germany, which was a capitalistic democratic society. And people in the city of Berlin were like fleeing, trying to get out of East Germany. And to try to prevent them from leaving, the Soviets built a wall. And during the construction, there's like pictures of like, um, East German soldiers deflecting, like just dropping their guns, running for it. Much like the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, like if you try to flee North Korea, they try to shoot you. If you try to flee East Germany, they would try to shoot you. And this wall kind of stood as a reminder of the Soviets' influence in Berlin until 1989, when it was torn down. And then a couple years later, 1991, the Cold War comes to an end and the Soviet Union collapses. um, let me see if you guys submitted any other questions. Yeah, we can absolutely. You won't. I Mochi Peach. I'm not going to go into too much about Saigon because it's never going to be on the test. Saigon was like the capital of South Vietnam, and the U.S. basically leaves. And if you've seen any like Vietnam movie, there's a million out there. My personal favorites: Apocalypse Now, Missing in Action, classic Chuck Norris. But you'll see like U.S. is just like airlifting people on helicopters out to ships and leaving, and then the communists basically come into Saigon and take over. But Senator McCarthy is obviously a senator during like the second Red Scare. So this is the Cold War is official. The first Red Scare was right after World War One because the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, had took place, and communism took hold in Russia, and they executed their czar, and the U.S. was like, oh my god, communism. So that's the first Red Scare. Second Red Scare, Cold War's going on, and Senator McCarthy is like, I've got a list of communists, and they are infiltrating our nation, and they are threatening our values, and they are everywhere. And so the House Un-American Committee, who forms to basically investigate these so-called communists and communist sympathizers who are in the United States threatening our very values and way of life, Remember, they're atheists, they're anti-capitalistic. It's, everything America is against. And they're like, if they take over the world, it's going to impact us. We're not going to be able to trade with communist nations. Our economy will collapse. Our very way of life will change. And so these people will be brought before the HUAC and put on, the stand and asked all these questions. And people were blacklisted, fired from their jobs. If they weren't U.S. citizens, they could be deported. People were jailed. Like, their whole lives were ruined. And then it just kept going and going, but no one would actually see these lists. He's just like, I have these lists. And then ultimately, he started going after like some higher ups in the military, and they're like, no, this guy's crazy. We got to put a stop to it. I know many of you read in English class Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is actually an allegory of um, the of McCarthyism, this hysteria, this witch hunt for communists, right? Um, and then McCarthy was basically ruined and, you know, fell into despair and alcoholism and died a few years later. Manhattan Project. I haven't seen a question about Manhattan Project in ages. Basically, that's the project that developed the atomic bomb that was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring an end to World War II. And it's usually justified with the fact that millions of American lives were saved because we didn't actually have to invade Japan, as well as demonstrating U.S. power. We were the only country with atomic weapons until like the 50s when the Soviets developed their own. President involved with the end of Vietnam. Well, you have Vietnam spans a lot of presidents. So it starts with JFK, goes through Nixon, and Ford kind of wraps things up after Nixon has to resign because of Watergate. Panama Canal. When we get the Panama Canal, we are now able to cut through the Caribbean into the Pacific without having to go all the way around South America. It saves a lot of time. Really convenient when you want to, like, take over Hawaii and get to Guam pretty quick. Dred Scott. So Dred Scott is what's the date on Dred Scott? Let me pull it up. I'm terrible with dates. I've already said that though. 1857. So Dred Scott was a slave. His owner moved to a free state where slavery was illegal, and he's like, I'm going to use this opportunity and I'm going to sue for my freedom. By which the Supreme Court said, sorry, guy, you are property, and we cannot confiscate property without due process. You don't have any rights. You cannot sue in a court of law. The Missouri Compromise is also unconstitutional. So the free state you thought you lived in, no longer free. And this was like a big win for slave owners and angered abolitionists, which kind of is a good way to segue into some Supreme Court cases. I'm going to be wrapping this up soon. I have like hours of videos where I go through general content. So if it's just a basic content question, I have videos on it. And if it's not covered by that video, it's probably not going to be on the test. Marbury versus Madison, judicial review, right? Marshall Court, judicial review. Macaulay versus Maryland, Gibson versus Ogden. All this has to do with federalism, the separation of powers between state and federal government. Gibson versus Ogden, sometimes called the Steamboat case. All these are covered in one of my other videos I can link. I would know 2 Supreme Court cases well in case you get an essay on Supreme Court cases. And what that means when I say well, know the historical circumstances. What's going on in the country that leads to this case? So like if you did Dred Scott, you would want to talk about the conflict over the spread of slavery as we expand westward. Then you would have to know, well, what was the court's decision? And then what was the impact, okay? I always recommend Plessy versus Ferguson, which establishes a separate but equal, and then Brown versus Board of Ed, which overturns Plessy and argues that separate is inherently unequal because the 2 cases connect, so it can make for some good analysis. But then you can also use that to talk about civil rights, reform movements. You could also use that to talk about violations towards groups in America. There's a bunch of different things you could do with that. Let's see. Mapp versus Ohio, Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona. These are all in the 60s. They're all expansion of civil liberties for people accused of crimes. I can post this link. I'm just going to post this link that summarizes like all the key court cases that are really popular on the Regents. Let me. Anyone with link can view. I'm going to change this so you guys can view this. Okay, done. I'm going to post here as a public comment. Summary of Supreme Court cases, big ones that pop up. Presidents you should know best. Like all the big ones: Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, Jackson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, all like super progressive presidents. Um, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, um, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, skipped him, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush. I mean, there's like a bunch of the key ones that you guys could check out. Let me go to, let's see. They are, according to my training that I've been to, they are not making any new questions. We have a brand new test coming out next year. They're focused on that, which means that they're pulling from their test bank. So if you're in my class, you've been doing practice Regents questions all year, you've been doing practice questions over the past week. These are all from the test bank. You will see questions either very, very similar, if not identical to what we've been working on. You can just Google U.S. Regents, and you'll see the New York State Board of Regents site, and you can just go there and look at all the old Regents with answer keys. As far as more recent presidents, Trump will not be on there. His administration is too new, and they're not making new questions. Obama has shown up. Typically, they're talking about some key components. So with like Obama, it's usually the fact that he continued the Afghan, Iraq wars, and Affordable Health Care Act could be on there. I think there was a question actually about Iraq. Yeah, so the GI Bill was created after World War II to help returning veterans go to college and get jobs, but also buy homes. This still helps a lot of veterans today. But another person had asked, the same person actually had asked about sending troops to Iraq. So after 9/11, there was rumors that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was used to invade Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom, we were finally going to get Saddam Hussein, who was still in control of Iraq even after the Persian Gulf War, or when I was a kid, I knew it as Desert Storm. And Saddam Hussein was taken out, and the U.S. has been there trying to stabilize the country and help establish open democratic elections with various degrees of success. So, as far as like recent presidents up through Obama, I would just know like, a couple of like key things. The big things is like just the common problems they've all been dealing with, like the war on drugs, massive issue. Many presidents have dealt with, can't really figure it out. Healthcare rising costs, the grain of America, like all the baby boomers are starting to retire. Will Social Security survive because not enough people are paying into it? The issues with globalization, and outsourcing. It's, American cars are now being assembled in other countries, and other countries' cars are being assembled in America. We're outsourcing jobs, like call centers and manufacturing to other nations. You have trade agreements like NAFTA and GATT trying to lead to free trade and open trade, and this has positive and negative consequences. So I would look over like more common recent things like that. I mean, they're not going to ask about every little detail. It's 50 questions for all of U.S. history. Let me see. I have like a summary of like all the kind of key things that you should know that I can post. Okay. I have like two computers going here, and like things are starting to get like really, really slow. Super slow. Excuse me. Any other questions before I like wrap this up? No. Someone asked about Napoleon Louis the 14th. That's wrong test. Uh, if you want to know about global, go to my channel. I have like global 10 videos that covers all of that. Just trying to pull up some other like content stuff that you can check out. If you want to know more content stuff, I have two videos where I go over all the key content you need to know for this test. It's in two parts. Colonialism through like industrialization and imperialism, and it's like World War II through Common Era. So if you're really concerned, I would go and check all of that out. Where is all of my summary? When you show up to the Regents tomorrow, you need two pens, dark blue or black. That's it. That's all you need to bring. Maybe a bottle of water. I know at my school, we start directions promptly at 8 o'clock, which means that you should be at our school by 7:30, 7:45. Don't stay up late. Seriously, by like 10 o'clock, if you don't know it, you're not going to know it. Go to bed. It is far better for you to get a good night's sleep and wake up and eat a good breakfast than to try to stay up cramming everything. Um, I usually only do an hour. I've already gone over an hour, but like I said, if you go to my channel, I have two US Regents reviews, one for early American history, one for later American history. It covers all the content. You can just watch that. I also have a video on there that covers like all the key constitution stuff. There's a bunch of stuff out there that you can look at. I'm just trying to find I have a document I can share along with my Supreme Court one um, that kind of summarizes some of the key stuff you should know. Mm-hmm. Okay. So on the comments on this site, I posted a summary of key content you should know and also Supreme Court cases. You can check those out. And again, if you go to my channel, you'll see I have a video. It's like 30 minutes on the Constitution. And then there's two US review videos that covers all the content. This video will be archived as well, so you can check that out. Let me see if I can. See if I can, after the video processes, I can add these in as links, but I can't do that until it processes. But if I go to my channel, okay, my videos. So I have a US Regents Review 2017. I think this one my camera wasn't working, so it's just me talking, but you can like just listen to it. I'm gonna post this. Sorry, I do not speak Spanish. Very little. Let's see. So these are like throwbacks. These videos are like, okay. I even still had darker hair in some of these videos. Each of these videos are maybe about an hour and a half. But I have, I can find it. I actually have a document with timestamps of every topic I cover in those videos. So you can like jump around. And I'll post the Constitution one for you guys too. In a comment here. So as far as writing the essays, your thematic essay is based on a theme. They will give you your theme. It could be like constitutional amendments, presidential decisions. There'll always be a historical context that you can use to help you with your introduction. And then they'll give you suggestions at the bottom of the page of things you can use. The task will have bullet points. That's what you have to write about. Take a few minutes to just jot down some ideas. I always say use the test to take the test. Go back to the multiple choice and look at some of the multiple choice to help you with those thematics. The DBQ, you need to answer all the questions to the documents. Those questions that you answer are like sentences you can use in your paper. I don't know how many times people like read the documents, answer those questions, and they don't look at those questions again. The sentences you write, you should be using those in your DBQ essay. So the DBQ essay will give you like 3 topics that you have to choose from. You have to pick 2. And usually there's like 3 tasks, 3 bullets that you have to do. Usually like the historical context, like a decision, and then like the impacts. There will be at least 1 document for each topic for each of the tasks. So if it's historical context, action, impact, there'll be a document on the historical circumstances, the action, and the impact that you can use to write the essay. The sentences that you answer the questions with should be used in your essay. My recommendation to make sure that you're getting like credit for outside information is for each document, try to identify like a piece of outside information. It's anything not in the document. So if they don't specifically mention the time period in the document and you know they're talking about like imperialism, outside info. Go back to the multiple choice. Anything from the multiple choice that has to do with that DBQ, pull it in. Outside information. Taking 10 minutes to do a basic outline is a lifesaver. Seriously, like you'd be surprised how easy it is to forget to put something in. So those are my tips for writing. Mm-hmm. Let me see. I have like all these videos playing. Let me see. Yes. I'm trying to find the document I have that like timestamps my older videos so you can figure it out. Here we go. Okay. So the last video, I posted a video with the Cold War through current era. I cover a lot of the Supreme Court cases there, but I also, in the comments, like on the video underneath, hopefully you can see them. I posted a link to a document that summarizes Supreme Court cases. Honestly, you need to know 2 well for an essay. The rest you should know generally what's going on with them, just so you can answer some multiple choice. There's no way you're going to be able to memorize every little thing about all the Supreme Court cases. No problem. My job is to help you guys do well on this test. Can you guys see the comments I made on the actual video with all the links to the Google Docs? Context on Brown versus Board of Education. So since the circa 1850, Plessy versus Ferguson had established separate but equal. It was supported by the federal government. The Supreme Court was like, it's okay as long as it's separate and equal. Of course, we know that facilities for blacks in America were not equal. They're typically underfunded. A lot of towns, they couldn't afford separate facilities, would just like close things down. We can't have two public pools, and we don't want mixing and races, so we'll just close the public pool down. And in 1954, Linda Brown's father, on her behalf, sued to have her go to the white school that was right like down the road from where they lived. She was being bused a really far way to go to a black school, and it goes to the Supreme Court where Chief Justice Warren. Chief Justice Warren was pretty progressive and passed a lot of civil rights legislation to help expand rights for minorities as well as persons accused of crimes. It's like separate is inherently unequal. Like this is not good. It's detrimental to their well-being, and basically this overturns Plessy. And this era of segregation starts to be questioned. It of course takes decades to um, really fully implement. You have things like the Little Rock Nine, where kids would have to be escorted to school. There's a lot of protests. It takes time. It really does. XYZ affair. So XYZ affair is like super early American history. So John Adams is president. I honestly haven't seen an XYZ affair question in a while, but you never know. Sometimes they throw curveballs. XYZ affair. So John Adams is president. George Washington's gone now; he retired, and we're still having problems with the French and the British, and they're impressing U.S. sailors. So they're forcing U.S. sailors to serve on like French and British ships. And John Adams is trying to get the French to stop this. And so he sends some people to France to negotiate an end to this. And at which point, like, sure, give us $250,000 and we'll stop and we'll negotiate and talk about this. And he was like, I can't believe they do this. And Congress was like, they didn't do that. Where's your evidence? So he takes the document in which they ask basically for this bribe. He crosses out the names of the people requesting it and changes their names with X, Y, and Z, which becomes known as the X, Y, and Z affair. And then, of course, people are upset about this. Never officially amounts to like any massive conflict between the US and France, because then eventually the French end up in a revolution and their king's killed and then Napoleon takes over, and then we see Jefferson buy Louisiana territory from them. So but yeah, I haven't seen the XYZ affair question in like a long time. Hi. Anyways, I'm going to be signing off soon. I don't have any more questions that were submitted for my students. You guys can go back and watch the videos I've posted. You can also go back and rewatch this. I'm going to do a last call for any questions. And then I'm going to log out soon. Because I too need to go to sleep so I can be there early to walk my like 8 miles around the gym while y'all take your test. GI Bill is gonna be like after World War II, so all those soldiers returning, we gotta do something with them, right? So it helps them like go to college, get loans. It was 1944. Um, but I mean, my uncle went to college on the GI Bill in like the 90s. So, um, hmm. But again, they're not going to ask you a question. If anything, the GI Bill, if it pops up, it's going to be like What did it do? It helped servicemen go to school, get loans, help them like, you know, after they return from war, etc. Yes, Tinker versus Des Moines in New Jersey versus TLO would be good Supreme Court cases to know well enough to write about, because you could talk about like the rights of students. So yeah, um, Supreme Court cases don't necessarily have to be connected to write a good essay about them, but it helps because it helps you build analysis and talk about like connections and everything. So with like Tinker versus Des Moines, they like support um, the students and their free speech. Um, during their silent R-band protests of the war. And then with TLO, you see again, like it's a question of First Amendment rights for students as well. Like, do they have these rights? What is the ruling? And just keep in mind, like, while students have rights, they're not absolute, and you can um, see them limited. Like we have dress codes, right? You can't just wear shirts with certain things on them. So we can limit your speech, your free speech. A couple more minutes just to see if any other questions roll in. Huh? Yeah, we'll be walking 8 miles. Trust me. I'm like, I took my Fitbit off. I gotta charge it tonight and make sure I get my steps for tomorrow. Every time someone asks when's the last time the Regents asked about Supreme Court cases, they always ask about Supreme Court cases. As far as an essay, I mean, it's pretty popular, even if it's not explicitly about Supreme Court cases. Often they're tied to Supreme Court cases, but you'll always have like multiple choice questions on Supreme Court cases. Um, yeah, I mean, there's 3 Regents every year, and honestly, I mean, I couldn't it's pretty common. You can go to the U.S. or the New York State Board of Regents site and look at when the last time it was. But um, yeah, I mean it's common. And like I said, a lot of these they double dip. Even if your theme isn't Supreme Court cases or like if it's presidential like actions, you could still be writing about a Supreme Court case. Like you could write about Korematsu versus U.S. and talk about FDR internment of Japanese American citizens. Um, if you could talk about Indian removal and Worcester versus Georgia and Andrew Jackson. So like just because the theme isn't Supreme Court cases, they connect because Supreme Court cases are basically what determines if these actions and laws are constitutional. So they tie into so many different themes. Um, the theme could be supreme civil rights. And you talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Ed. You talk about Korematsu versus U.S., Roe versus Wade. Like there's so many things that Supreme Court cases connect to. So the questions on this test are going to be from the current test bank. They're not making new questions. So yeah, they are going to be very similar. If not, some of them could be the same. Um, because the test changes. See. Um, let's see other questions. Oh, Atlantic Charter. Again, I haven't seen a question specifically about the Atlantic Charter because as far as World War II, we tend to focus on like U.S. gets involved because of Pearl Harbor. We drop the atomic bombs to end it, and then it jumps into the Cold War. But basically, it's just like FDR and Winston Churchill like agreeing on what their war aims are. That would probably be more of like a global or AP World question than a U.S. Regents question, honestly. Um, I'm gonna be wrapping this up though. Again, how should you format the essay? Introduction, by paragraphs, conclusion. I would write for like the thematic. I would have your introduction. Um, and then I would write at least one body paragraph for each topic you're writing about. So if you're writing about Supreme Court cases, you did Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Ed. I'd have one on Plessy and one on Brown versus Board of Ed. So typically it'd be like historical circumstances, decision, impact. And if you have a lot to write about, then absolutely break them up. Have one on historical circumstances, one on the decision, one on the impacts for Plessy, and then do the same for Brown. But if you don't have that much info, at least one body paragraph for each topic that you're writing about. I mean, the same goes for the DBQ. I mean, the only thing different with the DBQ is you are given three topics and you have to pick two, whereas the thematic, it's more like here are several options. You can use any or additional ones we didn't mention. But yeah, introduction, couple body paragraphs, conclusion at least. Okay. So wrapping up, two pens, dark blue, black. By 10 o'clock or so, if you don't know it, go to bed. Get up, eat a good breakfast, be at school early. Use the test to take the test. Go back to the multiple choice. You have 50 multiple choice that covers like colonial America through present era. Use those questions to help you on your essays. The task with the bullets are what you have to write. So go back and look at the bullets. Did I complete those? If you didn't, you need to add it in. Okay. Do I grade essays and see mistakes that are avoidable? Yeah, I grade essays. I'll be grading essays all week. I'm not looking forward to it. I just have to grade all the global essays from June 3rd. um, Mistakes that are avoidable. Um, Not completing all the essay task. People, for some reason, will do a really good job on historical context, and then the impact is like a sentence. No, like every one of those bullets of the task should have equal time spent on them. If you're writing a paragraph, your goal is to write a paragraph for each of those bullets, not just put like a line at the end, like this impacted the US in a negative way, the end. No, fully develop it. So not completing the task thoroughly is one of the biggest issues. Um, and for the DBQ, not having like outside information really limits as well is one of the biggest issues I've seen. And that's why I really stress like make a simple outline. I always tell my kids to make like a little grid and just for each topic have a space for each of the tasks and just write a couple things down. So like say you have like Plessy and Brown and you have like historical circumstances or decision impacts, and in each of those boxes you should have something written, and then when you write, you won't forget to write that. Even taking 5-10 minutes to do that can really save you from missing out, and not doing a section of the task. Um, Trying to see if there's any other questions. So I'm gonna wrap this up. It's 8:30. I don't see any other questions. No problem, guys and gals. No problem. So the court cases, I have a video I posted, the timestamp video under the comments. If you do like all of them, I have like a document where I summarize all the Supreme Court cases. Again, the Supreme Court cases in this document that I've shared, I can actually, I'll share it in the chat. This is a summary of the court cases that show up the most on the Regents. Know generally what they're about, but know too well in case you have a thematic on them. Okay. If you have a general idea of what they are, even if there's a DBQ on it, again, you will have at least one document for each piece of the essay you have to write about for each topic, and it'll be enough to pull it together. The thematic is where it's like what you know. Like if you don't know it, you're screwed, right? But don't panic because use the test to take the test. Go back to the multiple choice and look at the multiple choice and figure it out, okay? But again, know at least 2 Supreme Court cases well that you could write an essay if you had to about them. But other than that, I'm wrapping things up. I've shared a bunch of documents with you. My students, feel free to share stuff with each other, look into those documents, all that good stuff. And again, 10 o'clock or so, if you find you're still up trying to figure this stuff out, go to bed. Um, do I know all the possible thematic questions? Yeah. um, they are, let me see, I can post presidential decisions / actions, Supreme Court cases, civil rights. There could be a geography question. There's a really good resource that I borrowed, aka stole, and like modified from New Visions, which is a public charter school. I can share with you. Let me see. Again, all of those are on the New York State Regents. Search U.S. Regents, and you can go and see all like their past thematic essays. But let me go to. I actually here I have some like basic thematic review stuff. Thematics coming your way. Thematics. Okay. There's some thematic review I posted. Okay. I'm going to bed too. It's been a long day. I'm gonna be walking a lot tomorrow. Again, go to bed, hydrate, eat a good breakfast, bring your pens, no pencil, all pen, with you tomorrow, and I wish you all the best of luck. Don't panic. You're here. You've been working all year. You'll know enough to pull yourselves through. I promise. Okay. See ya.